Welcome, everyone. This is Joe Dager, the host of the Business 901 podcast. With me today is Paul Smith. Paul is one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling. He's a keynote speaker, storytelling coach, and author of the bestseller, Lead with a Story, already in its 8th printing. His new book is Sell with a Story. I know you've answered this question a couple times, but I think it's an interesting one. How truthful does my story have to be, right? I'm a sales guy, okay? Can I stretch it a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do get that a lot. And the answer is yes, you can stretch it a little bit, but not a lot. And I have some guidelines in the book for how you can know how much you can kind of stretch. Embellish stories is probably the way you would put that. And kind of the acid test that I use in there is, imagine that you've just told one of your sales stories to a group of 5 or 6 people. And then you realize that one of the people that listened to you tell that story was actually there when that story happened the first time, when it actually happened. And you're telling a story about that. And you didn't know that until you got finished telling the story. Would you be embarrassed, or would that person be offended at the way you told the story? And if the answer to that question, either of those questions, is yes, you changed too much. If the answer is no, you're fine. Right? If you changed, whether on purpose or on accident, the exact date that it happened, or the number of people that were there, or the names of the people, or some things that are just really not that important, nobody's going to be upset, and you shouldn't be embarrassed. If you change the entire outcome of the story and made it make a point that was really contrary to what the point that really happened, now you've changed too much. So that's kind of the acid test. The other part of that question is, can I make up a story entirely? Can I just totally make up an entire story? And my perhaps surprising answer to that is yes, you can, but only under one condition. And what do you think that condition is?
First thought is that nobody else knows it, okay, but that doesn't pass the acid test, okay. But I would think that you truly believe it would happen this way. I mean that it's a scenario that is pictured in your mind that could take place.
Yeah, so that it's a plausible thing that probably does happen. That's close, and I think that's a good criteria to use. The way I articulate that is, it's actually a little bit different. It's that your audience knows that you made it up. Okay, so as long as you tell your audience up front, and here's how that might go. You might ask me a question or ask me to give you an example of something, and I just can't think of a real story to answer you, and I might say, okay, well, Joe, look, I can't think of an actual case of that, but I know this kind of thing happens all the time, so I'm totally going to make this up, but just go with me on this because I think it'll help you understand what I'm trying to say. And then I totally make up a story and tell it to you. Now that's completely fine because I've told you that it's entirely fabricated. And so, of course, I can fabricate anything I want, but I think that's when your criteria comes into play. If I fabricate something that is not plausible, that probably doesn't happen all the time, then that's probably not also okay. So I think you might have just made me change my answer to now you need two criteria. One is that you tell them you made it up, and 2 is that it's a plausible story.
Well, can I blend stories? I got this guy over here that did step 1 and 2, but he never did 3, and I got this guy over here that did step 2 and 3, but he never did. He never did 1. Can I tell a story with them both doing it? I mean, is that fair?
So I think the less true to the facts your story is, the more obligation you have to your audience to give them some indication of that. So, for example, if I told you, hey Joe, gosh, something really cool happened about an hour ago when my kids came home from school. Let me tell you about that. You would expect that to be a completely true story because it happened to me 1 hour ago in my house, right? So there's no way I've forgotten it. It just happened, and it happened to me. It's not third hand or fourth hand. But if I tell you, hey, when I was in kindergarten, a kid told me this great story, and then let me tell you, and I tell you that story, like, you have no indication that that's a true story. It's not even my story. It's something told to me by somebody else, which means it could have been passed through a dozen different mouths before it got to me. And it was 40 years ago. So just me telling you that communicates to you to have very little faith that the story is true, but I can still enjoy the story anyway. But now I know that it's not something I'm going to rely on to be absolutely true. So I think if you were to say something at the beginning of that story that you're kind of cobbling together 2 or 3 people that would give them some indication that, this may be not the exact same person, or you might say, this is the kind of thing that typically happens. I've got clients that they do this, and then they do this, and then I've got other clients, they do this, and I got some clients that do this. Some of those clients may be the same ones, and some of them may be different ones. So I think you've given them enough indication just in those few words that they won't feel betrayed if they find out that, one of your customers didn't do all those things. Well, I kind of told you that up front. So I think you owe your audience that much honesty.
Go with that. And to a point you made before, I always was taught early in my sales career that you volunteer to write the recap. Okay, that if you come out of a meeting and you want a recap of the meeting or the follow-up letter, you volunteer it because you get to write it in your words and the way you understood it, right?
Yeah.
And
that's probably a wise thing to do.
And everybody looks at it and nods their head and says, "Yeah, that's what happened."
Good.
Or at least you're hoping.
By the way, that recap is story number 25. That's the last of the stories that you need, right? You're done with the sales call. Yeah, that number 25 is recapping the sales call, especially if something really interesting happened, like you got thrown out of the buyer's office, you got told, I'm not buying this product, I'm never going to buy it again, go away, I never want to see you again, or if you make the biggest sale of your life. Like those sales calls need to get recapped because something interesting and learnable happened there. And it's important to recap that in a storytelling fashion so that people will not only learn from it, but they'll be able to repeat it to other people. Right? If you come out of that with a recap that's like, here are the 7 things that happened in this meeting that people need to know, that's a list. People don't remember lists. But if you come out of it with, let me tell you the story of the sales call. Well, first of all, it started out awful because I spilled coffee all over the buyer. And then it got worse because, if you're telling the story of the whole thing, everybody can remember that. They'll tell it to other people. They'll tell it to other people. And pretty soon your whole company will have benefited from your recap because you told it in a storytelling fashion.
Well, I got to leave you go here, but I got one last question for you, okay? Yep. And is there a difference between a written and an auditory story or a spoken story? I mean, what's the difference when I'm looking at the book?
So the book is written assuming that most of the stories that you tell will be oral. It'll be you sitting in front of a buyer face to face or over the phone or Skype like we're doing or something. But you can write your stories too, of course. And the same rules apply, the same structure applies, the same emotion, it all applies. The difference will be when you end up writing your stories, they're going to be a little bit more formal. But the piece of advice I give there is write the way you'd like to speak. So if you end up writing a story and it sounds like a pompous corporate memo that with run-on sentences and sounds very, too corporate-y, with management speak, nobody wants to read that, right? So that's one of the benefits of writing stories is you can write them in a more conversational manner. So you should write your stories very close to the same way you tell them, but you're not going to have the stutters and stammers and ums and ers and backups and restarts and silly stuff like that we do on accident.
Where can someone buy the book Selling with Story? Of course, Amazon, but do you have a book website or your website? What's the best way to get a hold of you and learn more?
Yeah, thank you. So the book is Sell with a Story, and you can get it at pretty much any place right now, but Amazon being one of them. But if you go to my website, which is leadwithastory.com, which is just the title of my first book, you can get all my books there and find out more about my speaking and training engagements and stuff like that. And I do some podcasts if people want to listen to the podcast and get a new story every week. That's kind of the way I operate there.
Oh, I look forward to that. I'm going to listen to a couple of them. I haven't yet, and I noticed that on your website this week. So it's leadwithastory.com, right?
That's right. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate it. This podcast will be available on the Business 901 iTunes Store and the Business 901 website. So thanks, everyone, for